This is the July 27th, 2020 banned and restricted announcement for Cube, brought to you by Lucky Paper Radio. Once again, there are no cards banned or restricted in Cube. You may continue to play whatever you wish. No ban lists, no masters.
Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Anthony. I'm not Anthony, I'm Andy. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, everyone's favorite 1-1 Sapperling. Hi, Anthony.
And I'm Andy Mangold.
Oh, no, it's happening. We've
already made this joke. It's episode 5-ish.
Wait, what joke have we already made?
I mean, it's just we're making the joke of we're switching our names so soon.
Oh, because we're going to throw people off.
Because everybody makes that joke. Everybody has to make that joke at some point.
I guess. I mean...
Welcome to the podcast of jokes.
I think people can tell us apart. You're the one that says all the smart stuff. And I'm the loud guy.
Not so far this episode.
I mean, I so far have called myself the wrong name, so you're doing pretty good, I think. I think you're out in a pretty good lead. Did you get your own name right? It's like the SATs. True. You get points just for getting your name right, and then I have not gotten those points because I called myself
I never did test the theory that, was it actually that you had to get your name right, or just write a name?
That's a good question. If you get it wrong, I don't know how it's going to affect your grade, but you probably wouldn't ever get your grade, right? How do the SATs work? Do you know?
I couldn't tell you. It's been a while.
No, we're old men now. The SATs are but a distant memory. All right, so this week on the show, we are going to be talking about Anthony's regular cube, quote-unquote regular cube, which we drafted this week and had some vibrant discussion within our local playgroup about, and it led to some vast sweeping changes from you. So we're going to talk about that on this episode. But first, we're going to go and do our listener-submitted Pack One, Pick One. And this week, Anthony, we are picking from a cube called the Graveyard Cube. It's a 452-card vintage cube submitted by listener L. Thank you, L, for sending in your cube. Do you have a chance to look at this list briefly, Anthony?
I've taken just the briefest of glances, so I will be coming in a little bit cold, but I'm still excited to see what it brings.
All right, so I also took a brief glance at it, but really all I know is that it's a graveyard-themed vintage cube, and so we're just going to see what we have. So here's our pack, Anthony. The first card is Silent Gravestone. This one's not super common. This one basically says that cards in the graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities, and then you can pay some mana to exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card. So it's one of these grave hate artifacts in the sort of same family as Relic of Progenitus, etc.
Yeah, it's obviously very much a sideboard card. I am anticipating that it might be playable because it's a graveyard environment, and I see lots of cards that interact with the graveyard, but I'm probably hoping to start with something a little bit more proactive.
Yeah, and I'll say that even in a graveyard-specific environment, I would be looking for asymmetrical grave hate. I'm not sure if that's a thing so much, but here, this is going to exile all graveyards, which, if I also have a graveyard-themed deck, could potentially be hard for me to negotiate into a board state where I'm happy to crack it. So, yeah, not going to start on Silent Gravestone for me either. Next up, Heap Doll is a 1 generic mana 1/1 for a artifact Scarecrow that you can sacrifice to exile a card from a graveyard. So I got my wish, targeted grave hate.
You said it's a 1/1 for 1?
Yep.
It's interesting we're starting with 2 colorless cards. This still seems pretty low impact to me, so I'm not extremely excited about it, but maybe it's sort of part of an aggressive deck with some utility against other graveyard-specific synergies.
Yeah, both these cards seem pretty low impact, and so I'm not going to start with either of these, though I imagine they're both quite playable in this environment. All right, next up is Scab Ruinator. You may have heard of this one before, Anthony. This is a 1 blue 5/6 flyer. Pretty good so far. And as additional cost to cast it, you have to exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard, which is a big downside. But then you can also cast it from your graveyard. So it's a recursive 5/6 flyer for 3 mana that requires you to basically delve away creatures in addition to paying its mana.
I do kind of like that, especially if we're in an environment where there's a lot of looting and mill effects. It seems pretty easy to mill that early, get some more early interactive spells, and then get a lot of card advantage late game. Yeah, I think I'm definitely on this over the other 2 cards, even though usually we're high on colorless cards. This is just, for a Pack One Pick One specifically, but this is just so much more impactful than anything else we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, this card seems fine-ish in a regular environment if there's like a little bit of self-mill or whatever. And here in a graveyard-specific environment, I expect there to be a lot of ways to fill my graveyard. So, yeah, I'll take this over the Gravestone or the Heap Doll. Quick side note about Scab Ruinator. Have you ever seen the SCG Tour video where there is somebody playing Mud, the Legacy deck, versus a player playing, quote, Mono Blue Martyr? Have you ever seen this video?
I haven't. And I'm
going to send it to you and put it in the show notes.
There's Scab Ruinator. Boom. Got to remove 3 creatures from the graveyard to put it into play. Of course, it does cost 3 mana. Now Hatch will come in for 3 points of damage. 5/6 flyer. That's how he chooses to close the game out. Now, there is another Legacy card that costs blue 1 that does have power and toughness, but he's deciding to go against Trinate Nemesis in favor of the Ruinator.
So Martyr refers to, you may be familiar with the white Martyr because of the Martyr cycle, because it actually gets played in Soul Sisters a little bit. But the Martyr cards are always 1 mana cards that you can reveal some number of cards in your hand to have some effect that cares about the number of cards of a specific color revealed.
Right.
The white one gains life. The blue one counters a spell for each blue card revealed, I think. Anyway, it's just this it's this very fun video because I believe it's Patrick Sullivan and Cedric that are doing the coverage, and they're watching this totally oddball, off-meta, mono-blue tempo deck, which plays Scab Ruinator as one of its win conditions, dumps through this Mud deck, which is a pretty well-established deck with lots of powerful and expensive cards. I'm going to put that in the show notes, and I'll send it to you too, Anthony. It's one of my favorite, it's like, in the top 20 Magic videos I've watched a couple times that I really like.
All right, let's all watch it and fall in love with Scab Ruinator.
You too can ruin your opponents with Scab Ruinator. All right, next up we have Riel the Everwise. This is the new mythic from Ikoria. She's a legendary 0/3 that gets +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. And when you discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, draw that many cards, which is a weird ability.
That's really cool. Honestly, it's just really awesome to see somebody's cube and see all these like brand new cards in it, and it's like, wow, somebody's clearly paying a lot of attention and giving a lot of love to this design. I think that was a gold card. It's definitely extremely strong.
Sorry, 1 blue-red.
It's extremely powerful, but I don't think I'm going to take it over a monocolored card at this point. And the Scab is also quite strong, so yeah, I'm still on Scab.
I think I like Riel here partially because I think the upside is really high, and Scab is a monocolored card, but the reason we like monocolored cards is because they're guaranteed to make our deck no matter what, and generally easy to cast, even if you have, tough mana considerations. And, the Ruinator, I can imagine us drafting a deck that we just can't put Ruinator in because we didn't get enough self-mill and it just becomes uncastable. So it does actually have limitations to it, even though it is a monocolored card. Whereas Riel, the floor is pretty bad. It's just an 0/3 that, gets a little bigger if you have instant or sorceries in your graveyard. But the upside of this with, like wheel effects or any kind of like discard outlet, which I imagine there are a bunch of in this environment, seems like a really high ceiling. So I like that it seems so far that this gold card stands out above the rest of the pack, which is what I want gold cards to do in every limited environment. And I think it's worth it for me. So I'm going to take that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's just sort of what you're saying is that we use, like colorless versus monocolored versus multicolored as a proxy for this is a more or less narrow card, which is more or less likely to make into our deck. But you're actually saying that despite being gold, you think it's less narrow than the Scab Ruinator, which sort of requires you to build.
I'm kind of guessing, right? I don't know the environment very well. It's possible that you always end up main decking Scab Ruinator and it's just a bomb in this environment, and I don't know that. But from reading the cards and with what little I've looked at the list, I actually feel like, Ruinator, despite being monocolored, is somewhat narrow. And yeah, like basically that what you're describing, that's a heuristic that we use because it's shorter hand and it's easier than thinking about every single card in complete isolation and trying to figure out how linear they are. We have these shorthands. It's like, well, if it's colorless, it's more open than a colored card, and if it's cheaper, it's more open than a more expensive card, and low devotion cards are more open than high devotion cards. But the rules text does matter at the end of the day. So yeah, that's my argument for taking Riel at this point.
So how narrow do you think Riel is? Because it has this effect that can give you a lot of card advantage if you're discarding cards. It also is just one of these, I'm sure there's a name for it, all these blue-red cards that get power equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Do you think that you actually can just put this in a deck and end up with just a very potent creature?
No, I mean, you're right. You do need discard outlets, and you do need really instants and sorceries in your deck for this to do anything. So I guess I see this as like a build-around, but with the ceiling high enough that I think it's worth going towards. Whereas the Ruinator is also a build-around, but seems a little narrower. Like, I need to have specifically creature cards in my graveyard, not just any kind of cards. And I guess this just feels like the payoff is there, even though I do need to be conscious of what I'm drafting from here on out.
Okay.
Next card is part of one of my favorite cycles in Magic. This card is Devastating Dreams. Are you familiar with this one, Anthony?
I'm not.
All right, this is red for a sorcery. As an additional cost to casting it, you discard X cards at random from your hand, and then each player sacrifices X lands, and Devastating Dreams deals X damage to each creature.
What now?
Yes, this is a great cycle of cards. So this really kind of plays like a very cheap Wildfire-esque effect that can scale, depending on how many cards you want to discard, with the huge additional cost of discarding a bunch of cards from your hand, and at random for this particular one, which is quite bad. So, I don't really know what to make of this, frankly. I don't think it's the pick, but it's a very interesting card to have in the cube for sure.
I'm intimidated by this card. I don't have a good sense of how it's going to play out, so I'm probably just making a mistake at just going with a little bit of familiarity bias, but I don't think I'm interested in taking this yet.
All right, here's my plan. Ready? I'm pack one, pick wedding Riel. I'm going to wheel Devastating Dreams. Who else is taking Devastating Dreams at this table? Nobody. Discard my whole hand after I get Riel in play. Wildfire, draw a whole new hand, turn it into a Wheel of Fortune, and then I keep hitting land drops and my opponent's locked out of the game.
Okay, I hope you have fun with that.
I'm a magical Christmas land over here. Yeah, not the pick for me. Eternal Scourge, the 3/3 you can cast from exile.
From exile, not from your graveyard?
Only from exile.
Only from exile? That doesn't sound particularly interesting to me now.
Yeah, I think this is primarily a combo card with Food Chain, and I mean, it's just a 3/3 for 3, so in lower powered environments, that seems totally fine. It also has this ability, which is that whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability, it exiles itself, which means that it's effectively immune to removal. It kind of gets bounced if your opponent tries to remove it in any way, which means you can cast it from exile. But this environment already seems powerful enough that I am not interested in that level of the card, and I don't know what else. I guess if I exile my own graveyard with Silent Gravestone, then I can cast it from exile, but
yeah, I think that's worth mentioning. There are a lot of ways, I think, to interact with the graveyard, and if you have a card like Scrabbling Claws, you can target it for free, or not target it, but exile it for free. So it definitely seems like a good value, but it doesn't look super appealing to me here.
Yeah, I'm not on it, but could be something. Next up, Terramorphic Expanse.
Cool. How does that compare to the other fixing in this environment? I think it's pretty low.
I'm looking at the list now, and I'm seeing that we do have
full set of fetches.
We have a set of fetches, and then we have
OG
it looks
duels.
like a revised duel and a shock land for every guild, and then some additional land that changes based on the guild. So we have cycling lands for some of them. We have horizon lands for some of them. So it looks like a combination of just horizon and cycling lands. Plus we have the triomes here, all 5 triomes.
So I think fixing is always good. Evolving Wilds is probably going to make my deck if I take it at any point. But I think coming into an environment for the first time, I don't want to assume that I have the time to play a tap land.
Yeah, this is... I'm not taking this here. I don't like Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds, personally, especially in cubes that have, fast fetches, just because it feels so much worse to be doing a slow fetch. I imagine here the land in the graveyard is more relevant than in most cubes, which is
that's
a
good
consideration. Point. But really, it's I don't actually think this is correct of me. I think there's a very good argument that so far this should be the pick because it's 100% open. It's going to make our deck basically every time, and there's probably some additional small edges in a graveyard-focused environment. But I just really, really hate not casting my spells on time because of tap lands. It's a big pet peeve of mine, and it tilts me more than it should, so I'm off it. Now we have Bone Horde. That's 4 mana for an artifact equipment. It's got Living Weapon, and the equipped creature gets +X, where X is the number of creature cards in all graveyards, and then it's got Equip 2.
Well, this was a staple in my very first Gerard Golgari Lichlord Commander deck.
I still have haunting nightmares of that deck.
I'm interested in it. Sorry, remind me what the converted mana cost is.
4 to cast and 2 to equip.
4. I think I'm still not quite into this. It's definitely a strong card, and it is colorless, but it's hard for me to imagine I'm going to have enough cards in the graveyard that I can, cast this as even a 4-mana 3/3. Obviously, there's a lot more upside and a lot more effect late game. But yeah, I don't think it's quite getting there for me yet without actually having seen how it plays.
Yeah, I'm off it personally. With no evasion, I don't want to pay 4 mana for just a big dude that I guess obviously I can equip it to other dudes, so it becomes
it's a big
an
dude that you
equipment later.
can put onto your other big dudes with evasion, or your small dudes that have interesting keywords.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm extremely not interested in either side of it, in just the big dude or just the equipment that enhances creatures. The fact that it's both is obviously better, but yeah, basically this environment between cards like Riel and Devastating Dreams seems like it's going to be unfair enough that I'm not interested in this, especially if there's stuff like Silent Gravestone running around and you can just completely
that's true.
Nullify my 4-drop with a random 1-mana spell you cast. So not for me personally. All right, Golgari Thug. This is a 2-mana 1/1, has Dredge 4, and when it's put into a graveyard from play, you put target creature in your graveyard on top of your library. I say 2 mana, it's 1 and a black.
This card seems reasonable. I think as far as monocolored cards, I still like the Scab Ruinator more. But this looks highly playable.
Yeah, the 2-mana, the 1/1 is basically feels irrelevant to me, unless this is an environment where there is very little flying and trample and stuff, and this can be a reliable chump blocker. But this is really just a very slow value engine where, if you can play it and sacrifice it, you get to put a creature on top of your library, then you can judge it back, and you can play it and sacrifice it again, and very slowly churn people out. But it also feels a little slow given some of the stuff we've seen in this pack to me personally.
I mean, I think the value is that it has this interesting combination of dredge and being able to get things back, not necessarily with at card advantage, but get things back some way from your graveyard. So depending on the sort of power level disparity in your deck, you can end up milling your large portion of your deck and then being able to get back the key pieces, which I think is a really cool sort of mini game.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's difficult to know exactly how it'll play out.
It feels to me like it's going to be a solid role player in that deck, but not the reason to be in that deck, which means I don't
think
really
that's
want
a
to
really
take
good
it
point.
pack pick one.
Okay.
All right. Similar card, actually, in terms of it being a role player, but not going to pull me into this particular color. We have Gather the Pack, which is a green cantrip-style card. It's 1 and a green for a sorcery. You reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You get a creature card from among them into your hand, and the rest go into your graveyard. Ooh. And if you have Spell Mastery, you get 2 creature cards instead.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is going to be really, really strong. But it's just like you said, it's not going to pull you into that particular color yet.
Yep, I rate these effects very highly, even outside of graveyard-focused cubes. I mean, the fact that this puts cards in the graveyard is just kind of gravy for me. I just like efficiency and making sure I always get to use my mana and always find cards to cast and don't run out of resources. So I wish this could also get a land, because if I'm, casting this on turn 2 and looking for a land, it's going to feel bad to have to take a creature instead. There are lots of green cards like this that also have the option of getting lands. But yeah, if I end up in the sort of self-milled, dredgy deck, that'll be a similar role player to Golgari Thug, but not good enough to make me want to jump into that archetype already. Breath of Life. This is just a 4-mana sorcery that returns a creature card from a graveyard to play, but it's 3 and a white, so it's a white Zombify.
A white Zombify. I don't think I'm particularly excited about that either. You said it's 4 mana?
4 mana.
Yeah, I think this is similar. This feels like maybe a C+ in this context. It's going to be reasonable, but there aren't a ton of gigantic targets for it. You really want to be getting your 4 mana's worth by in exchange for the risk of putting this in your deck. You want to be able to get a more than 4 mana's worth of creature out of it, and I don't know how easy that's going to be.
Yeah, I gotta say, from briefly looking at the list, because now I'm wondering how supported is Reanimator, because I think of Reanimator mostly as a kind of unfair combo deck that if it has a really good deck and a good draw is kind of unbeatable in a lot of environments. And this would be a card that would go in that deck. But I'm looking at the list and I'm not seeing very many reanimation spells. So I don't feel like it's going to be reliable that I'm going to be able to get that. The other reanimation spells I'm seeing are Living Death, which is kind of a little bit, has other stuff going on, not a clean reanimation spell and not fast. I'm seeing really nothing else, actually. So yeah, I don't like it as just a 4 mana, get back the best thing in your graveyard unless you're putting stuff there to do unfair things. and I don't get the sense from this list I could do unfair things, truly unfair things. So I'm off it as well. Next up is Turn Timber Sower. This is a cool card from a recent Commander product. This one is 2 and a green for a 3/3. Whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, created a 0/1 plant creature token, and you can pay a green and sacrifice 3 creatures to return target land card from your graveyard to your hand. So more self-mill and or land shenanigans with some land recursion on a reasonable body, which is already a 3-mana 3/3.
When I first read this card, I was so excited. It has so many interesting keywords and effects, and it interacts with all the card types
Can I guess
like.
what made you disappointed in it?
Yeah, go.
I bet you first read it and thought that it triggered on all the land cards that are put into your graveyard, and not just once for any number of land cards put into your graveyard.
That would make it better, but I wasn't even thinking that specifically.
Darn. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. What do you think about it now?
I think it's fine. I think that there's a good chance it'll end up in your deck, but I think it's just way slower than it first reads to actually be able to generate value from it.
It's definitely a very slow, it's up there with Thug in terms of you're really going to grind people out if this is going to be how you're going to win the game. The O1s are good chump blockers. It's nice to get a chump blocker, pretty reliably if you have a way to mill yourself. But yeah, that I think it was a payoff, but not a good enough payoff to pull me into this deck. So
Right.
just to recap, are you still on Ruinator at this point?
I'm still on Ruinator, I think. It's the most obvious, build around me and it'll work. A lot of I could definitely see after playing this cube, my evaluation of a lot of these cards changing, but...
For sure, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm still on Riel, which I admit is maybe a little bit little greedy, but it seems like a very high payoff card, and there isn't anything generically powerful enough for me to be confident in taking it, so I feel okay taking a more build-around card because I think the ceiling is there and I want to build around it. We have 3 cards left, though. And the third of the last cards is Green Warden of Marasa. I believe you know this one.
I do.
What do you think of Green Warden in this environment?
Green Warden is tempting. I think it's a little bit too expensive just in terms of mana cost for me to take this early, but it's definitely high on my list. Again, I'm worried that might just be familiarity bias because it doesn't actually do interact with a ton of cards in this environment, maybe, but it seems pretty strong.
I mean, getting 2 things back from your graveyard is quite good when you have good stuff in your graveyard. I rate the card pretty highly. It's, for me, it's actually kind of close to being a card I would happily play, even in the most powerful cubes, except it has no kind of evasion. It's just a 5/4. So you're putting a lot of stock in that ability, because there's a lot of boards where a vanilla 5/4 isn't do anything for you, because your opponent has, let's say, 5/0/1 plant tokens from their Turn Timber Sower, or they have a Golgari Thug, they can just chump block with it forever. So the body I actually don't rate very highly, so it's kind of 6 mana, sure you get a body, but mostly it's how good are these, getting cards back from your graveyard. And I'm with you. I'm not going to commit to 6 mana for this card just yet. Next is a card that is a favorite of mine, though not a cube favorite of mine, traditionally. It's Squee Goblin Nabob.
Is Squee just busted in this format?
So, this is the 3-mana 1/1 that at the beginning of your upkeep, you can just put it back in from your graveyard into your hand every upkeep. So you just keep getting Squee back. He refused to die. So there's basically 2 modes for Squee. There's the level 1, which is pretty bad, which is that he's a chump blocker every turn that keeps coming back to your hand. The real value of Squee, though, is that him combined with any looting effects, especially repeatable looting effects, basically turns those looting effects into card draw, because you end up discarding Squee, you get Squee back, you discard him again, you get Squee back, and so you're just discarding this card that doesn't matter, and it turns all of your looting effects into more card advantage and less selection. But it does cost you that first card, right? You still discarded Squee the first time. That could have just been another card that was good that you could have cast. So you want to get if I do that 3 or 4 times in one game, then I feel pretty okay that Squee has pulled his weight. But if I'm only doing it once, then it's just not really giving me the value I want. So to your question, is it busted? I don't think so. What do you think?
I'm kind of excited about it. I mean, if I look at some of the other cards in this pack, like Golgari Thug and Gather the Pack, a lot of these cards, and maybe even the reanimation spell, a lot of these cards both require some setup and don't actually generate card advantage. And Squee, I think, specifically combined with some very cheap enablers, can actually generate a lot of card advantage. And it does have like a mode of you could just play it and then, get it back later and do some stuff with it. So I kind of like it. I think that's probably at least my number 2 right now. Maybe could beat out Scab.
All right, so you got a 5/6 flying zombie horror competing with a 1/1 legendary goblin that just is a
legendary goblin.
A little legendary man that is a diplomatic goblin. So
I guess maybe the
he's
narrow,
not that high for me.
The narrow aspect of it is it probably only fits in blue-red specifically. I don't know how much looting you're going to see in other colors. So that's probably the biggest reason I would prefer not to take it this early.
Well, he's kind of similar with dredgy stuff. You get him back the first time, and then it just is additional value from dredging. But I agree. I mostly want to combine it with repeatable looting effects to feel like I'm getting full value. Yeah, I'm not so high on it. So for me, it's still Riel by a pretty big margin, I think. And then I think I'm on Scabaruinator second, and then honestly probably Terramorphic Expanse. But our last card, Anthony, is a Flooded Strand. So I'm going to take Flooded Strand personally, and is that what you're going to do as well?
I think so. I think that overall we've seen a pretty even power level. Well, I shouldn't say that. We've seen an even power level, I think, with proportion to the amount of setup and amount of color costs. So nothing here really stands out to me. And then Flooded Strand, I imagine, is just going to be only much better in this environment where there's a lot of other things that care about the graveyard.
Yep, yeah, and when we talked about doing this segment, you expressed a little bit of concern. You were like, how fun is it for people to listen to us pack one, pick one, fetch lands all the time? But I think it's worth talking about at least the first couple times we take a fetch land, just why they are so good. And in this particular environment, there are 2 fetchable lands in every color combination. So this Flooded Strand already, for sure, is going to fix us for white and blue if we end up in white-blue. But with any combination of dual lands, can not only fix us for any combination which includes white or blue, which is, that's 7 of the 10 color combinations include... No, I guess only... Yeah, 7 of the 10 color combinations include white or blue. So that's already 7, tenths of the cube. But in a pinch, with the right combinations of dual lands, this could potentially fix for our, green-red deck. It's entirely possible. It's not likely. It's not where you really, really want to be, but it is very, very, very high potential. So, we're basically looking at the same amount of openness, as far as I'm concerned, or very near to it as Terramorphic Expanse, with the huge upside of getting those lands into play untapped and possibly fetching 2-colored lands to fix for complicated mana. And especially in an environment like this. So I will say about this, I really like what I'm seeing from this environment. I like this pack, and it strikes me as the kind of cube where there are not going to be an abundance of generically good cards, which is my own cube is an environment that very much focuses on that. And so in my cube, it's like you can just take generically good cards all day and then, only commit to something, in the middle of pack 2 or something where you're going to finally make a committal pick where you're going to choose a card that makes other types of cards in the cube worse or, better. Here, it seems like very obvious that the lane you're in is going to be very important. And there's if I'm playing the, Riel deck or the Scabaruinator deck, there's just, I imagine a ton of cards, even in my colors, that are not going to be great in my deck. So I'm really motivated to wait to see which lane is open and not take a Riel, and then it turns out the person right next to me first picked a, Wheel of Fortune or, some other card that's really good in the Riel deck. I like taking fetch lands highly for that reason, and I'm especially going to do it here because I don't know the environment very well, and I want to see which of these lanes is open, by picks 3, 4, 5 before I start committing, if I can do it.
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable to me.
Drafting is so fun, Anthony. It's that weird balance, right? Because if Flooded Strand was not in this pack, my pick would explicitly be to commit very hard to a gold card that requires instant sorceries and, really requires discard outlets. But that's the balance of this pack, right? Flooded Strand is generically good. I'm happy to take it. It'll go in basically any deck that I draft, or at least 70% of the decks I could possibly draft. And then after that, these cards don't have enough of a reward in combination with their, flexibility for me to be happy taking them over something like Riel, which has a really high ceiling. So there's these interesting, scales that need to be balanced.
Yeah, and I really appreciate looking at this pack that often will just say, oh yeah, just take the colorless card first, it's easy, stay open. But there really is a increase in power level between the colorless cards to the gold cards, so it really makes it, has an interesting tension and makes you interested in drafting those gold cards.
Yeah, Silent Gravestone, Heapdoll, Eternal Scourge, and Bone Hoarder not scraping, not near the top of the pack for me. I will also say, having now seen this whole pack, this pack has Silent Gravestone and Heapdoll in it. I'm feeling a little bit, just from this pack, like there's going to be enough Grave Hate that I'll be able to find some mid-pack. I don't have to take it aggressively. And I feel like most decks are going to want some Grave Hate in them because it seems like, being able to exile your opponent's Scabberoonator from their graveyard or whatever would be really valuable. But I think it's going to be in enough density that I don't have to like fight tooth and nail for it.
You know what my favorite thing about this cube is? I'll give you one guess.
Does it contain Bag of Holding?
Correct, you got it.
Oh, man, got it. They're so predictable. All right, thank you, listener L, for sending in your cube. If you want to draft L's cube or check it out, I will put the link in the show notes. Very grateful to her for sending it in. And if you want to have your cube featured on Lucky Paper Radio, you can send your cube link, your brief description of it, just so I understand kind of what the vibe is, and your pronouns to mail@luckypaper.co, and we'll put you on our list. I will say, so we've gotten a good response to this call for listener cubes. So if you send yours in and we don't do it immediately, don't feel like we're ignoring you. I am going to try and basically choose cubes that have some kind of interesting thing about them. So, the sort of, regular. I mean, it feels so bad, Anthony, to like refer to a cube as like a regular legacy or vintage cube. But there's definitely an archetype, right? That the sort of is very popular amongst cube designers and cube players. And doing a pack one pick one from those kind of cubes every week, I think will get a little bit boring. I'd love to use this to kind of showcase the weird, goofy, different kinds of cubes people have, and really challenge our pack one pick one skills, I think, too, with different environments. So yeah, that's kind of what we're looking for, but we'll definitely do some regular ones in there too. So yeah, send them on in and we will do them. Anthony, we drafted your cube just was it yesterday? 2 days ago. 2 days ago we drafted your cube.
Who can remember?
Do you want to give a little draft report?
I would love to give a draft report.
Draft report.
I don't want to give a draft report. You give a draft report.
Why? I talk so much.
I'm too much caught up in it. What'd you draft?
All right, I'll give my perspective of the draft. So we drafted Anthony's quote unquote regular cube. You call this your regular cube.
Yeah.
And
so I could maybe summarize. So it's a lower powered sort of middle power environment. It's specifically sort of, I love limited. I love especially some of the Masters environments. Modern Horizons was just a fantastic draft environment, and that's really when I sort of kicked into gear and said, okay, some of these kind of power level cards and some of the specific cards really complete some holes that I sort of saw in the like sketch of a cube list that I had going for who knows how long. So it's really focused on creature combat, but is very much plussed up in terms of the power level, in terms of like the strength of some of the synergies. I also really want to find as many cards as possible that have very open-ended ways to interact with them. So it's not just, A-B mechanics. It's this card has counters, so we can have all kinds of cards that also interact with counters in all kinds of different ways. So there's a lot of depth to the draft. You can draft many different kinds of decks and see how each card goes up or down in value by sort of small amounts based on what you've already drafted. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. I think it is. I also, and tell me if I'm off base here, but I might just be being completely self-centered, but I feel like this cube, part of the reason it exists, why it does, is because my cube, which is, a normal-ass cube like every other cube everyone else has, existed in our playgroup already. And so part of the motivation here was like, well, we already have a cube where we can play mono white aggro, or we can play, big green ramp or whatever. And so let's explore different territory for all of those things. And in that sense, I feel like you have kind of pushed away a lot of the classic quote-unquote cube archetypes or decks that people would put in a cube, even of this power level. Is that safe to say?
That's 100% true. Yours was the first cube that we built in our playgroup, or you built in our playgroup, and it's not the only one, but I definitely wanted to do something a little bit different. And I think some of the foundational areas that really are relevant and impact the rest of the design are, number one, in the lands. So you have a very classic, well, maybe not classic, maybe pioneering mana base of a full set of fetch lands and 2 sets of shock lands, plus some additional high-value lands. And those are very cool. I enjoy playing with them, but I also love man lands and bounce lands and scry lands and all these other things. And I felt like that combined really well with also taking a different approach on generally the power level and especially the 1-drops. So there are very few 1-drops. The aggro decks are focused more on interesting 2-drops. So you won't see in mono red 12 1-mana 2/1s that have minor variations between them. Instead, there's more of a different array of 2-drops, which I'm not sure how successful this is yet, but it's sort of my design goal.
Yeah, and there's aspects of that I really love, right? One thing I mentioned when we played this on Wednesday is that I love how good the manlands are in your environment, which is to say they're not oppressive, like they're not, the best cards in your deck, but I played I love manlands. I think they're so cool. Just the idea that, your control deck plays a tap land and then later on has this win condition that is a land is very appealing to me. And it's also just, if we're talking about Magic videos I really, really love the, I guess it was the Chicago Pro Tour very early on. I think 1998 was the year where Bob Maher plays this like Bant control deck that it's Bant Oath actually, but it's oathing for like Shard Phoenix because Magic was weird.
I gotta tell you, the more I look at Bob Maher's deck, Brian, the more I like it. You can really tell that Bob has played this deck through multiple tournaments and really understands what's going on.
It's a very impressive deck. Not just the main deck too. The sideboard is extremely impressive. 13 different cards.
Gotta love an Enlightened Tutor sideboard, similar to Vampire Tutor sideboard. You just put one of things you can tutor for that will devastate certain opponents.
And it plays a lot of mainlands, plays a lot of treetop villages specifically to beat down with. I love those cards. But in my own cube, I tried for so long to make Creeping Tar Pit, Celestial Colonnade, those kind of cards work. And basically, they just never got activated. My cube is like fast and ruthless, and you can't really get to 4 mana to start or 5 mana to start activating your Celestial Colonnade and beating down. It's very, very unlikely to happen. So those had to get cut for basically untapped lands, so you could be guaranteed to have your Wrath on exactly 4 and not die because you drew your tapped land. And that bums me out. I wish those cards were viable in my environment, but I have to there's a lot of trade-offs to making them good. So I love that about your cube, that we can make those cards playable. And I think it's a good goal.
Do you think they're less effective in your environment just because it's faster, or is it also to do with the fact that there's just more abundant ways to get a card advantage in other ways, so you don't necessarily have, or you just always have other options of things to do?
It's probably a little bit of both. I definitely aim for efficiency is one of my highest goals in my cube for all the decks across the spectrum, right? Even for control decks, I want them always to have something to do with their 1 mana on turn 1, whether it's a cantrip or it's always a cantrip basically. I want them to have a cantrip on turn 1 so they can always do something with that first mana. So I think it's just because efficiency is so highly valued, you're not only going to have games that go very quickly because the aggro decks are very good, but you're also going to have a lot of mana sinks. You're going to have a lot of card draw and a card advantage, so that you always have stuff to do and you're never sitting there kind of twiddling your thumbs. And as a result, you just never it was. I tried to keep track for a while. I think almost a year. I asked everyone that drafted. I had the 2 Tar Pit and Colonnade in there much longer after the others because I think they're the 2 best man lands, and no one ever activated them, just ever that I ever heard of, which was the big bummer. So they got the axe. Anyway, this draft of your cube, though, I have my draft log here, so I can actually take you through my drafts a little bit and tell you what I was thinking as I was going, and talk about the deck I ended up with and how it turned out for me. I regret my pack one pick one, but pack one pick one. I took Earl of Squirrel, Anthony.
Why would you regret that?
Pick one. Well, so the pack for your cube, I don't think it was a very great pack for your cube. It didn't have anything that really stood out to me. The thing it was competing for, in my mind, was it was competing against the Ketria Triome was the next best card. And in hindsight, I wish I had taken the Triome. Actually, I think I wheeled it and still played it in my deck, but I could have wheeled something else maybe. I don't know. But the Earl, it's a Baneslayer. It just dies to removal, but your environment does not have such a ruthless, unfair amount of removal running around, so you can actually stand a reasonable chance of sticking your 6-drop and getting to brawl with it. And if you do get to brawl with it, it's extraordinarily good. It's so good. It just spits out 2/2s, like no one's business. So for me, this was like the Riel of this pack. It was like, all right, well, I don't know if this deck's going to be open, but none of these generically good cards are worth me, staying open. Instead, I'm just going to see if Earl of Squirrel gets there. And that was my pack one, pick one. Pick 2 was pretty easy for me. I took Planar Outburst, which is one of the few Wraths in your cube. And I like the board wipes in your cube quite a bit. I think they are some of the best cards because the as you said, the aggro decks aren't as fast. So, getting to 5 mana is a kind of a given in almost every game. And there are very few planeswalkers, and they're all the sort of uncommon rarity ones that mostly have down ticks. So killing all creatures means you're basically killing all threats pretty much, except in very rare circumstances. So it really functions the same way that a board wipe does in a normal limited environment, which is to say it's a huge swing of value. You get a lot of card advantage off of it. Took that second, and then pick 3, I went for a Curator of Mysteries, which is a card I like for being very flexible, either a cantrip or a 4/4 flyer. Pick 4, Anthony, I got Squirrel Nest. And I was like, all right, well, I've got Earl Squirrel, I've got Squirrel Nest. And I took that over Horizon Canopy, which I wanted and also ended up wheeling out of this pack. But I took a Squirrel Nest, and then the rest of the pack was kind of, in my opinion, what I was trying to do was draft white something control, usually white-blue, because I already had, a Curator and stuff. And I got some okay white and blue spells, and some green stuff did wheel, which was maybe a sign. But what I didn't see at all was, more controlling cards, right? Like, all the removal that I got in white was the kind of removal that only really works if you're aggressive. And then I, kept wheeling these little white dudes, right? And I get these little, creatures, late in the pack. And just felt like someone else was taking my control cards from me, and I needed to basically pivot a little bit. So pack 2, pick 1 was Mist Syndicate Naga, which is a card I love and think is extraordinarily powerful. And then from there, I kind of committed that pack based on what I was seeing in the packs, which was not a lot of green, to playing a blue-white tempo deck, which is what I ended up playing. Blue-white tempo. I did end up splashing green for a couple cards just because I was short on playables and had a decent amount of fixing, but I could not splash for the Earl because it's double green and 6 mana. And my games went well. So I was managed to the finals, and I got beat down by a deck that was just playing pure value. And Jay is also worth noting, I think, one of the most accomplished and skilled players in our play group. Like Jay is definitely a better Magic player than me. He's more practiced. He just has more experience. He's a better player. And the deck he drafted, it felt like I couldn't beat unless I had a perfect draw. And I did not have perfect draws. I had a multi 5 and stuff, and it was kind of, whatever. So yeah, I liked my deck. I thought it was fun. I just lost to pure value. Everything Jay played was 2-for-1s, 3-for-1s, and I was sitting there trying to out tempo him with some stuff, and I just couldn't get ahead enough to really threaten him. But I like my deck though. I thought it was cool.
Yeah, so I'm interested. I know you've talked a lot about blue-white tempo and how it's a really interesting archetype and something you'd even like to support in your higher powered environment.
I love tempo.
But you were also maybe had a little trouble taking off your designer hat and are a little bit critical of just some of the card choices. But it seemed like your deck was clearly one of the strongest at the table. So, overall, you were happy with it?
Oh, yeah, I like my deck a lot. I did not mean to imply otherwise. I definitely, I will admit, I was a little bit salty having to lose to summon
Exactly what happened.
Well, exactly what happened is game 1, I lost to a curve of turn 2 explore, turn 3 tireless tracker, play a land, turn 4 get Rog Monster, and then I just didn't have removal in my pool. I had 2 removal spells that would proactively remove a creature without it being tapped or attacking me or something. And I just didn't draw them, and then that sort of value engine of tireless tracker, get Rog Monster just ground me into the ground very quickly. And it was very clear in that game that it did not matter what I drew. I had no outs from turn 4. From turn 4, it was no hope for me. I couldn't have possibly won that game. And then the next game, I had a multi 5, and then I drew very poorly in the early turns of the game, but my opponent also had a much worse start. And then I finally got a little bit of something going, but it was way too late because he just had too much mana. And then he resolved Summon the Pack against me, which, for those of you who don't know what Summon the Pack does, it is an uncard that lets you open a booster pack and put all of the creatures from that booster pack into play. And in your cube, Anthony, we just take 15 cards from the cube at random, which is significantly better than opening a booster pack because the cube is much more powerful than a normal booster pack. So the first time, he got 7 value creatures with a bunch of ETBs. And then the next turn, he played Kess and did it again. And I cast Summon the Pack again.
He had
and
11 mana? Am I doing that math right?
So what actually happened is I had already Fiend Huntered the Kess, and he, I think, had a 1 or 2 mana bounce or removal spell to get Kess back for less than 4 mana. But yes, he had a lot of mana, a ton of mana. So I was a little bit salty after drafting what I thought was a sweet deck, and then in game 1 losing to like extreme value, and then in game 2 losing to a 9 mana card, which I loathe. But I did like my deck. I did not mean to imply otherwise.
All right, well, I'll have you know, Summon the Pack, as of about an hour and a half ago, is gone. It's going to go...
Praise be.
It will remain in a special place in my heart and a special place in my box of Magic cards. But it's not coming. It's not coming out until we build the Uncube.
Yeah, it's... I don't know how much it's worth talking about, but Jay, every time he cast it, was like, I don't even have fun casting this. He's like, this is just... It's not fun for me. It's not fun for you, but it's good, and I've got to do it.
Right. I mean, my original intention was, it is delightful to, especially, when we get to play in paper, to pick up those 15 cards and flip them over and see what you get. It's effectively 8 mana. You just win the game. It's hard to imagine that you don't unless your opponent has a Wrath right away. But yeah, it's a little clunky. So you get that hit of dopamine, but that's only fun so many times.
We actually had a discussion, Jay and I. I'm curious to know how you weigh in on this. Do you think that Summon the Pack is better or worse than Ugin the Spirit Dragon? And let's take the colorless clause out of it. Just like 2 resolve. You're playing sub deck. I'm telling you right now, you can resolve one of either of these cards in the big bell curve of possible board states. Which one do you think is better?
I don't think that's really worth discussing. It's like 8 mana win the game or 8 mana
but
win
it's
the
fun!
game. It's fun!
I think that Ugin is much better because you have options, right? Like on some board states, you don't have to immediately minus. You can just plus to kill their biggest threat and then, take a couple hits on Ugin and, develop your board otherwise. On most boards, it's just a huge board wipe that leaves you with a Planeswalker at the end, which is very good. But Jay thinks Summon the Pack is better. And as I said, Jay's a better player than me, so maybe Jay's right. It's hard to say.
I mean, yeah, I think in this specific cube, both are basically unbeatable if you can resolve them, which is a big if. They're expensive. But I think that probably Summon the Pack is a little bit better.
It can quote unquote whiff. You could spend your 8 mana and not win the game, or get like a bunch of dinky little creatures that don't do anything, which would be feel bad. But I've never seen that happen personally. Every time someone resolves Summon the Pack, they do seem to win the game.
I mean, in this context, it's like there's so many creatures with ETBs, and there were some packs where even there was a creature with champion, so you even got to trigger an enter the battlefield effect and then tuck it under your champion creature, and then even if your opponent's Wrath, you still are able to get some value back out of it, which is really punishing.
So that was my draft, and I wonder what your thoughts were about how your draft went. I know you drafted mono red, which is your mono red does not look like people might expect in your cube because of the reasons you mentioned before. So how did your draft feel and go?
It felt good. I mean, it was a little bit surprising. I definitely don't expect people to draft monocolor decks. But red was just so extremely open. I think that I was taking mostly red early. There were also some very powerful red-green cards. So I definitely expected to be either going Boros or Gruul, even like through pack 2. But it ended up I just had such a density of red cards that it felt like the consistency of playing a monocolored deck was worth giving up whatever the most powerful cards were in green was really what it came down to at the end. I don't know if that decision was right, but my deck felt strong. And this was even after, I should say, we had some long discussions and before this draft made some major changes. And I was really, and a lot of the focus was to try and make aggro a little bit more viable. And some of the cards we'd added, like especially Rick's Maudie Reveler, which is basically just a bear that gives you a rummage, and some of the Heartfire Immolator, which is a creature with prowess that can also be a removal spell, and Hobble Fiend, which allows you to get some value from sacrificing things. All these cards played out very, very well. I was also really happy, surprisingly,
that's encouraging.
With Claim the Firstborn. Just as, the challenging thing I think that the red decks have in this environment is reach, like a way to actually close out the game. And being able to take your opponent's best blocker, get a good attack through, and then even get some extra value through some way to actually sacrifice that creature was a lot of fun when it added up.
I think Claim is quite good in cubes where there are not decks that don't care about creatures. Like if your cube is just different speeds of decks attacking each other with creatures, then I think Claim the Firstborn is quite powerful and probably worth consideration. So do you think, Anthony, we talked last time on this podcast about how I often fall into this trap of whatever the most recent thing I've been working on in my cube is what I end up drafting. Do you think this is what happened to you? Do you think because we we talked and we added a bunch of red 2-drops and cut some of the stuff at higher CMCs that you were kind of naturally drawn to that deck or just felt it was open because you were seeing these cards that we just added?
I can't imagine that was not at all happening. I think there was at least a little bit of that. But I do think at the same time red was fairly open. I don't think when we actually flipped all our decks, anybody else was heavily in red.
Nobody else was heavily in it. Like Daniel was in it only as much as he can get more legends that to fill out his legend curve. And then I think Ankit had a little bit, and of course Jay had a little bit. But yeah, nobody else was really heavy in red. It seemed like I agree with that.
I mean, this is sort of another point that maybe is worth mentioning about this cube, is that there are a lot of little cards that I think support very small synergies.
Very small cards, like,
very
like
small
fire,
cards.
just half of the card.
But I love when, we can put a card like Johira, Weatherlight Captain, in here, that it takes up very little space in the cube. It's, reasonable in just a artifact-heavy deck. But it also, you can just say, I'm going to take this and just go completely nuts, and I'm going to build around this 100%. And that's, being able to really play into individual players' what they enjoy without taking up a lot of space in the cube is a lot of fun. Another example, we talked about how manlands are pretty effective, and we have cards like Sylvan Advocate that is like a lord for all of your land creatures. And it's still just totally viable in an aggressive deck, but it kind of gives you this little opportunity to say, I want to build the land creatures deck and go ham, and that can be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, Daniel is, we love Daniel. He's one of our favorite players, I think, and members of the play group. And Daniel will kind of just do whatever he wants. And so, yeah, Daniel basically tried to build a legend, historic, tribal deck in your cube. And honestly, kind of got there. Like, we have Jehoiaro, we have Weatherlight, we have Wrath Capuchin, the ship's mage, I guess is what he's called. We have Traxos, Scourge of Krug, and then, a bunch of other stuff kind of filling in this curve. I mean, there is, you can make an argument that deck does exist, and I think he was a few cheap interactive spells off from having a pretty powerful engine that would have been hard to interact with.
Right, yeah, I think that if you take this sort of card pool, and if you had maybe been able to use a few picks in one direction or another to be maybe a little bit more controlling and sort of utilizing the multiple colors it's playing, or slim down to 2 colors and be a little bit more proactive, I think it could work. Be pretty viable, yeah.
Do you want to talk about the winning deck and the conversation we had about that? Or I also have some thoughts on, or some questions rather, about some of the additions and cuts you've made to your cube. Which direction do you want to go?
Well, I think if we talk about the winning deck, that will definitely lead into some of the motivations for making some changes. But maybe before that, we should just say, so I have everybody took a picture of their deck, and overall, I think I'm delighted. Like, everybody has these pretty reasonable curves, synergistic decks. Somebody's playing sort of a more artifact matters. Somebody's playing a bit of a blue-black control deck. Obviously, it's actually 2 of you, you and another one of our friends, was playing sort of a blue-white tempo deck. One of them with a little bit more of a enter the battlefield sort of theme to it, and even a little bit of a combo with Core Skyfisher and the white monument, Oketcher's Monument. So overall, it's like, these look like the kinds of decks that I expect people to draft.
7 of the 8 decks do. And
7 of the 8 decks.
Dear listener, let me read to you some of the cards included in the main deck of the 3-0 deck this time. We have Palaka Worm, Greater Sandworm, Explorer, Sakura Tri-Belter. That all sounds great, very reasonable. Then we have Tatyova, great, little splash. Gitrog Monster, fine, splashing it. Kess, Dissident Mage, all right, getting a little greedier with the splash. 3 colors off the green, and so far no other instant sorceries, but, whatever. Nesting Dragon, which is a 5-mana red card. We have Young Pyromancer down here. Oblivion Ring, the first white card we've heard of. Really just, the drafter of this deck admitted himself, a kind of a pile. This deck is a bit of a pile, and performed very well. They got the 3-0 and pretty decisively. Like I said, the game I happened to play against this player, I had no outs by turn 4, even with all the draws left in my deck. But how did you? We had a lot of discussions about this deck already, Anthony. But what is your main feeling about this deck?
I think I want to compare it to, we had talked before about how our friend Day had drafted a deck that was blue-red and very effective, but sort of ignored some of the gold cards. And you asked me if I was happy about that, and the answer is like, yeah, the deck still played the kind of play style that were interactive games. It was a good match. At least the one that I lost against it, and hopefully that was true for everyone else as well. But this deck really, it's not a like, ooh, I never knew the cube could do that. What a wonderful moment of discovery. This is, oh, you're sort of ignoring the tracks and the breadcrumbs and the signals there, and you're just doing something very not interactive and trying to race your opponent to getting these sort of either extremely kind of powerful value engines or these expensive cards that just win the game on the spot. And that's definitely a red flag as far as I'm concerned as a designer of the cube.
I'm honestly a little surprised still, even after having played a match against this deck and, seeing how other matches. I guess we should say that one of the matches this deck did draw, which is because they didn't have time to finish the round. So it's the 3-0 deck by means of not having lost, but didn't actually get 3 match wins. But yeah, a lot of these cards are very suspect to me, and the sort of the player in me, which wants to always draft a very focused deck. This is a flaw of me as a player, right? I know this about myself. I hate getting mana screwed. I hate not drawing my, splash color or whatever. I want to play very efficient Magic, very tight Magic, where I'm using all my mana, and I'm like, I have a game plan, and I'm focused on that game plan and trying to execute it. And a deck like this, which is kind of like, well, my game plan completely depends on which quarter of my deck I draw, because there are 4 parts of this deck that are all going in totally different directions, and I've got 5 colors with pretty sketchy mana in some places, so I got to get a little bit lucky not to get mana screwed here. This is not my kind of deck at all. But like I said, this is a flaw of me as a player, because I think it's entirely possible that in a lot of environments, perhaps this one prior to these edits, like this is actually a very good strategy, right? And what I think this really comes down to, and I mean this in no way to be a slag on the environment, is that it felt like this player just had the best cards, and the best cards just won the game. And the other considerations of the game, like tempo and, card advantage and those kind of things, just didn't matter because these cards were just better. Which is, of course, drafting a cube it's a meta, right? It's a self-balancing thing. I should have not passed all these good cards to this other player. I should have taken them instead of taking my cheap interaction and cantrips and thinking I'm going to build a sort of very lean tempo deck. But that's how the games felt to me, is that just these good cards won the game and my cards are not as good.
No, you're completely right. And I think that especially when both tempo and card advantage don't matter against this deck, then that's not going to be a fun play experience. So yeah, I mean, I will say I have rather quickly performed a quick hot fix and banned a couple of these cards from the cube. And I feel bad about that. I don't just want to say well, that card won, clearly it's too powerful, so we should cut it. But I think that we saw from all players involved that this was just a strategy that was not promoting an interesting gameplay style, and just was very overpowered. And I think if we continued to with the same play group do another dozen drafts of this cube as is, like you said, there would sort of settle on a meta where people would value those cards appropriately, and it would not be such an issue. But at the same time, that's not really sustainable for a cube, because we want to play with a variety of people. And if there's these options for these extremely broken decks that just the people that are in the know can draft, that's also problematic.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think
about that a lot.
Really?
Yeah, I think about the fact that we end up drafting with the same or very similar group of people very often, and I do think that as a cube designer, I think you have to try and think about your cube in a vacuum, which is this ideal you can't possibly ever achieve, right? You're always going to draft with players. They're always going to have biases. But I think it's really hard to draft with the same people and then use that information to inform this abstract idea of your cube in a vacuum as to what it actually is, right? I often wonder if I just gave my cube to 8 people that none of them knew me, none of them had ever played the cube. Let's say they're all really accomplished players. I would be really curious to see what would happen in that situation where nobody's familiar with this list. They're just going to sit down and draft it and use their brains trying to figure out what's best. Because there's definitely these stories end up happening and these ideas of what's effective or not effective in the cube end up percolating in a play group, and then it becomes very hard to get players to try new cards. You put a new card in you think is actually great, and the player that drafts that deck just doesn't play it because they don't think it's good, and it could be great and you would never know because they're just not playing it. And I think it's in this weird spot where it can be very hard to actually gather what I would consider to be useful data about your cube's performance.
Definitely. So yeah, I mean, when I look at this deck specifically, I see a real problem with the environment, which is that the proactive decks are not fast enough to beat the extremely powerful, expensive cards, and there's also too ample fixing, such that it just makes sense to say, oh, okay, well, I'll ignore all my sort of early interaction, or there's like, I mean, honestly, Jay is just next level. He's like playing Young Pyromancer in this pile, because it ends up just like chump blocking for 4 turns, and then you resolve something insane.
That's an example of one that I still can barely understand. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I mean,
don't worry about it. One day we'll understand.
There are 5 being extremely generous. There are 6. I'm not going to count Summon the Pack. Summon the Pack is the 6th one. If you're counting that as a
I
trigger
can't
for
Summon the
Young
Pack.
Pyromancer,
I also get this one element.
it does not matter. So there's 5 instants and sorceries in this deck, and 2 of them, Cultivate and Explore, you would almost certainly need to cast in order to get the red mana, which you have perilously few sources of, in order to cast your Young Pyromancer in the first place. So yeah, that one just, I mean, it feels very suspect to me, but, you know, I lost. What do I know?
So yeah, I mean, I think we can point to the kinds of cards that enable this kind of strategy, and that's actionable, and we can fix that. I think there's another aspect to it, which is just that I think we need to admit that Jay is just like a level above the rest of us, and we are all trying to draft the right way, and we are trying to respect the decisions of the draft designer, of the cube designer. So people are sitting here saying like, oh, okay, well, I see a card here that says, I care about artifacts, and I see another one, and these are both blue-black, so maybe I'll try and draft like a blue-black Artifact Matters deck. Or someone else sees a card that cares about heroic and drafts, some creatures that care about being targeted, and some pump spells, and, there's obviously some interesting play there. And Jay is not looking at that. He's not trying to like solve the problem as he's making his picks and trying to listen to sort of like what are the signals that are set up by the cards he's looking at. He is able to look at the pool in a broader sense and just say, well, that's the most broken strategy. These cards don't matter. I'm not going to go pick by pick and try and figure out what colors are open. I'm just going to say, if I don't see one of those cards that are in this class that is so much above the rest of the power level, I'm just going to take a land. And by the end of pack 1, like, sure, maybe I don't have a lot going on, but I'm going to have enough fixing that when I do see these cards that are of a too high power level, I can just take them, and then I'll just run the table with those. And like when I think the Oblivion Ring is like the perfect signifier of that. It's just like, it's just a statement of saying,
the lone white card in the whole deck.
Not many of your permanents will matter. I will be able to block things. I will be able to, interact with things in one way or another. But, this is the way I can interact with your one Bolus's Citadel or your one, giant creature. But otherwise, his goal is just to get to the point where he can play these extremely powerful spells.
Yeah. I do want to challenge, only because this is the thing I've been thinking about myself a lot. You said that one of the problems this maybe points to is too ample fixing.
Okay.
And I want to start off by saying I don't think the mana in this deck is very good. I don't think that this has like a great 5-color mana base, and because this fixing is so great, these spells are easy to cast.
What do you mean? There's so many good fixes. There's a forest, a mountain, a swamp. These all make different colors of mana.
Right. So let's be straightforward. This drafter has 8 non-basic lands. Couple of them temples, couple of them bounce lands, 2 triomes, and 1 horizon land here, the Nurturing Peat land. So no, you don't have fetches in the environment, right? So like none of these lands produce all 5 colors that this person needs. The triomes come the closest in that they produce 3 of the 5 colors. But most of these are just kind of enter the battlefield tapped, produce 2 colors, and hope you draw the right combinations of mana. And we could do the math, right? This is a good example. We can do the hypergeometric math and figure out, like, somehow quantify how good this mana base is, like how likely you are to cast each card in this deck based on the number of sources. But I suspect that the result would be not that likely, in all things considered. So I have this theory, and I would love for you to poke holes in this theory. My theory is that the quality or abundance of mana fixing in a cube actually has very little to no impact on the number of colors that people end up playing. And here's the sort of reason I think that might be. If you have a player that wants to play a bunch of colors, I've seen people play 4 colors with nothing but basics, right? Like, people will do it. Like, you can't stop them, right? And it's not even to say that's necessarily the wrong decision, right? If the environment is such that the gold cards are extremely powerful, there's these huge power swings in, these particular cards, and there's not a lot of pressure from an aggro deck, that maybe it's right to, in some, let's say sealed pool for a retail set, just to play 4 colors, play all your bombs, and just run it out. That could be the objectively correct thing to do. But either way, every drafter has in their own head this scale, right, where they're weighing the risk of putting a card they might not be able to cast in their deck versus the benefit, the reward of being able to actually resolve that card. And fixing changes the equation, but it changes it for every card in the entire pool. So take myself as the sort of alternative example. And like I said, this is a flaw in my gameplay, I think. I hate losing to my mana being bad. So this deck has 8 non-basic lands. That's the number of non-basic lands where maybe I would begin to consider a splash. Like splashing, a third color, because it feels like with 8 non-basics, with the right overlap of colors, I should be able to have enough sources to hit that splash reliably. That's not enough non-basics for me to want to play 5 colors. And even 4 or 5 non-basics, I just want to have a really, really good 2 mana base and just be guaranteed to cast my spells on time. So I'm at this one end of this theoretical extreme. Maybe this drafter who played 5 colors and didn't bat an eye is at the other end of this extreme. I'm not actually convinced that making the fixing better or worse is going to change that continuum, that relationship we have to those cards. Can you poke holes in this for me? Do you actually think that putting more fixing lands in your cube leads to these kinds of decks?
Can I rephrase and tell me if this is right or wrong, like what you're describing, that good fixing impacts the proactive and reactive, or the fast and the slow strategies, the same? So it shouldn't actually mean playing more colors is right, because if the faster deck has better fixing, they can also be faster, or faster more consistently.
Right, so specifically, I guess my theory to consolidate it more is that I don't actually think the quality of fixing or amount of fixing affects whether or not a 5-color pile like this is good. I think it is entirely contingent upon how good the aggro decks in the environment are. And you could, take all this fixing out, and just cut down to 2 lands in each color that just come into play tap, just Guild Gates or whatever. And I think it's still entirely possible that this deck would be the best deck you could draft, even if your fixing was way worse. That is my theory, at least. And I'm not convinced that's true, which is why I want a big brain person like you to poke some holes in it.
I mean, I can't really. I think you're totally right, but I also think it is relative. So I think it is that the person who's trying to play more colors is taking on more risk, and if that risk is faced with a very aggressive strategy, it's not going to be worth it. But I think when the mana fixing is also ramp and is also paired with expensive cards that are just head and shoulders above the power level of the rest of the cube, all of that comes together to not be able to compete in an interesting way and against an aggressive strategy. I mean, I think honestly, a big part of that is just that I'm trying to say, let's slow down the environment a little bit, and
right.
The best 2-drop, what do you like most? Carry Zev maybe versus Goblin Guide is a pretty big downgrade, and
Carry Zev herself is really only good, super good. She shines most in an abundance of other 2-drops and 1-drops, in a really aggressive deck. Carry Zev in a sealed pool, a limited, pre-release, I'd probably play her, but she's not probably the best 2-deck in my pool, I would imagine.
That's fair, yeah. But if we compare that between Llanowar Elves and Rampant Growth, I think Rampant Growth is still better. And you would play Rampant Growth in your sealed deck in whatever format. And it both being able to fix you and ramp you at the same point. I think all of these work together to make this strategy much, much too viable and not really leave other decks with a chance.
Rampant Growth is very good. This deck has Explore, Sakura Tribe Elder, and Cultivate as ramp spells, which is not very many. 3 ramp spells is not a lot, but in the games where you get to resolve them, you have a big advantage because there is so much beef at 5 mana in this deck that is very hard to answer without efficient and unconditional removal, which also is not a super abundance of. So yeah. I don't know. I guess that is that's the thing I've observed, right? Because the mana fixing in my cube is, quote unquote, better than the mana fixing in your cube, in that I have the full set of fetches, I've got a smaller cube, I've got a higher ratio of fixing lands to the size of the cube. So theoretically, mana bases should be better, but This kind of thing certainly never happens in my cube. Honestly, I rarely get people playing 3 colors in my cube, and when it is, it's like barely just kind of a little splash. And so I'm led to believe that like the mana fixing is a very small component of that puzzle, and it's really just a question of like how much better are your 5 drops than your 3 drops than your 2 drops, and is the environment such that I can reasonably expect to kill my opponent where all their 5 drops are stuck in their hand and they can't resolve their good cards because my deck is just fast enough. And when the 5 drops are this much better, it's like maybe you should just be playing as many 5 drops and 4 drops as you can, and play whatever the cards you have to fill in between to make space for that to happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it comes down to mana fixing as a component, but that sort of can be a component that affects everyone equally. It really comes down a lot to speed and the delta in power level between your cards at different costs.
So your attempts to... What are your main ways to try and fix this? I know you banned some specific cards, banned, quote unquote. You cut the Gitrog monster from this list. You cut Cultivate. What are the cuts you specifically made because of the experience we had on Wednesday?
We shouldn't just say the experience we had on Wednesday. Like this happened in the previous draft as well. Like it's been circling around this that the last winner was playing, cards with four green pips and 3 blue pips and. Again, in a 4-color deck. Like, this is clearly a strategy that has been proven. I think it is hard to see it sometimes because I think in a lot of the games that I've played, especially doing, grid drafts or other, like, not a full pod draft, but other ways to play it, people are very much willing to look at the synergistic cards and say, like, okay, I'm going to try and, build this artifact deck or whatever. But really, when we have these, like, big brain players that are not just trying to like find what they should be doing, but they're just saying like, how do I break this environment? How do I optimize this the most? These are the strategies that come out on top. And the strategy has been just to try and bolster aggressive strategies, bolster proactive strategies. So like you said, it is more risky to be able to play 4 colors. At the same time, I have cut just some of the cards that are either, not fun to play against, like some in the pack. Fun for a little while, but farewell. Gitrog Monster, again, is like one of those cards that I think people are overlooking when they're looking for these sort of, synergistic decks, or they're trying to find out what's going on there. And it's always sort of...
I'm definitely overlooking it. I can say that for sure.
I think it is... I've always thought it was too strong, but players don't take it very highly, so I just haven't really worried about it. But yeah, then
that's part of the problem too. Like if this player is just wheeling the Gitrog monster because everyone else is like, well, this doesn't fit in my focused deck, then the fact that this person can prioritize fixing, prioritize whatever cheap interaction they can get their hands on, and then just get these big bangers on the wheel is a problem.
Right.
A problem with the draft, not a problem with the cube. I mean, like a problem with the way that the draft pod is breaking down. Like that's the fact that we're not valuing these cards highly enough could contribute to the outsized performance of this deck.
But it is a problem to a degree if you're a new player and you're just looking at the cube and that doesn't appeal to you, and you consistently lose to these like weird slow value engines. That's not necessarily a fun experience for anybody.
Yeah, I think what you said is really important and good to sort of emphasize, because the thing about like one draft is not a reason to make a bunch of changes to a cube. That is very, very true, and I do think it would be a big mistake for listeners out there to like take away from this that, if somebody does well with a deck you don't like, you should just go ahead and sort of axe those cards. Really, like the way I think about it, and I'm curious if you also process things this way, is that this is like one data point on like a long continuum of data points, but we don't play Magic enough. We don't play this cube enough to ever be able to make data-informed decisions about what needs to be cut or what's overpowered or what's underpowered. Jet on our own website has a great article about like just how many drafts you need to do and matches you have to play before cards that are twice as powerful as other cards begin to actually show up in statistically significant sort of numbers. Now it doesn't even account for differences in player skill and all kinds of stuff like that. So I don't think it's possible to like say, well, we're going to gather enough data points to make a decision. What this data point actually I think does do is it helps us understand and like craft an explanation, a narrative for like what works in this environment and what doesn't work. And we can describe how this deck came together and why it came together. And this data point serves as a justification for that explanation, right? It serves to like point to like that explanation might be true. And what you're basically describing is that like as you've been watching people play, you've been playing yourself, a similar deck, did well last time, and you started to basically form this story. And then with this particular draft, you had this story in your head already. This draft reinforced all those things and kind of was the final nail in the coffin of this story about what seems to be doing well in this cube appears to be true and is going to lead to me make some changes. And that's a long process. It's not like if someone did well, we're going to cut some cards, which is not a thing I would advise cube designers to do, is just cut the cards that do well.
That's definitely true. And I should even say that with my mono red deck, I did not do well. I went 1-2, but the decks that I was playing against, I felt like I had a chance. I felt like I had outs, and there was interesting back and forth play. I actually didn't play against Jay, but just observing some of the matches, it was clearly not an engaging game. It was just I'm going to try and do this tempo thing, and then you're just going to play the Gitrog monster, and it's over. So yeah, it's I absolutely don't want it to feel like it's a reactive thing.
But I mean, it is worth noting that experience is valuable. Right? Playing games, you learn, you gather actually just way more individual data points than you could ever formally label, right? Like you said, you played this deck, it didn't do as well as you wanted, but you felt like the games were even. You felt like if you had just drawn a little differently, you had some outs, which is a lot different than someone who's just well, by turn 4, I'm dead. I have nothing in my pool or in my deck that could possibly have gotten me out of a situation. Those are both, wins and losses, right? They're both a win and a loss, the same on the sort of record sheet, but it's very different data for you as a cube designer to influence what is working versus what is not working.
Right. And I also it's very fun to be able to draft a thing, and even if you don't win, to be able to look back on the draft and say, ooh, well, actually there were a couple opportunities I had where I could have taken cards that actually would have given me outs or given me a little bit more reach in this situation. So it's that's a positive thing where you can look forward and see opportunities to improve rather than just saying, oh, you resolved your one spell that, beats 90% of the decks in the field.
Always gathering data, always trying to make our cubes better. It's a journey.
Right, and for me, better doesn't mean more powerful. It means you have a better gameplay experience, and the cube isn't, the draft experience isn't just solved, and the games aren't just rock, paper, scissors, which other opponent, which kind of deck they have that you're facing. That there's always some interplay and opportunities to make interesting and challenging game decisions.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I that's also my goal, and I think this is a thing that I think a lot of maybe new cube designers don't realize, but the reason that these kind of power optimized cubes are so prevalent, I referred earlier to a regular cube where it's playing all of the quote unquote best cards with slight variations for people's tolerance for variance or disagreements on card evaluation or whatever. The reason those cubes I think are so prevalent is because if you're going to pick a power level, it is so much easier to pick the extreme end of the spectrum than it is to choose something in the middle, because card evaluation is really hard. It's really, really hard to say, all right, how good is Nesting Dragon compared to these white 2-drops? It's well, that's a really difficult question to answer, and it's contextual. As soon as you change 10 cards in the cube, the answer could be totally different depending on what those 10 cards do. And what you've done, which is basically chosen a power level, which is somewhere not at the extreme end of the spectrum, right? You're not saying I'm playing the best cards no matter what, and then it kind of work from there, is a much more challenging design challenge than basically saying, well, I'll play the best cards I can, and, eventually I end up cutting Mind Twist or whatever, because it's just too crappy of a game experience. But it's much easier to kind of keep pushing up than it is to focus down. So I really admire the cuts where you're this card's too good, it's going to come out. Instead of trying to make everything better to make that card fair again.
I mean, it's not even just too good. Obviously, there's a lot of context, but there's also just sort of lateral moves. I had tried Feasting Troll King, which I thought was interesting because it's a very aggressive cost. It has this nice amount of redundancy or resilience, I should say, where you play it, if your opponent removes it, you get one extra shot, and also as a bonus, if things interact with artifacts or life gain, there's some extra play there. But it just
opponents could stop you from getting it back with a disenchant or whatever, if you had to gain a life because you were going to die.
But it just, in the context, lined up so badly against a lot of the removal in multiple colors, and just always ended up coming back. There was very little opportunity to actually block it. It having vigilance just ruined the game. So I'm really excited to try Palaka Worm, which maybe it's a little bit less exciting, but it still has some of that resiliency. It still gives you back some value if you just say, I cast this and your opponent casts Doomblade. but it isn't just like, well, that's face up. I know what's going to happen. I know how this game ends, and I have no way to interact with it.
And, the fact that these cards are good in your environment is one of the most unique and special things about it, at least in the sort of scope of cubes that we draft, right? Like, I do have a cube that I have pushed as far in the power level spectrum as I'm comfortable with before I think games really devolve and become too coin flippy. And as a result, I have just as much efficient interaction and removal as I can get. Efficient counterspells, efficient interaction. And so, like, a card like Palaka Worm or the Gitrog monster or Feasting Troll King is like never going to get there in my cube. So the fact that these cards are playable and are good, it's a very interesting space to play with and explore.
Would the Gitrog monster really not cut the mustard?
It was actually in there for a while, and very few people played it. And when they did, it was definitely not good enough. No, the thing is that 5 mana is a decent spot. I am ever more wary of 6 and higher mana cards, but I think 5 is a good spot, especially for ramp decks, because in my cube it's very possible to play a 5-drop on turn 3, and 5-drops are very powerful, and they're extremely powerful on turn 3. But the fact that the Gitrog monster is kind of a pseudo 6-drop if you want to get value out of it guaranteed, because you need that extra land, like a fetch land or something in play to basically immediately draw a card off of the Gitrog monster when it comes into play. Makes it, kind of in this weird space. And then, there's just so many cheap ways to interact with the 5-drop that didn't do anything the turn it came into play that it becomes a big liability.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, do you think it's also part of it is that there's just a lot of other ways to get card advantage? So saying, I'm going to play this card that's going to generate some card advantage next turn and pretty slowly is just not going to quite stack up.
Yeah, I mean, the main way to generate quote-unquote card advantage in my cube is Planeswalkers. I actually don't have, if you look at the lists, I don't have a bunch of other ways to generate card advantage, especially outside of blue. Like, there really isn't anything else to do. But I do have a lot of Planeswalkers. I like the play patterns they lead to, and they do generate a lot of value. And so, if it's like my Gitrog monster is going to try and outvalue your, even like Nissa, Who Shakes the World, or Vivian, Monsters Advocate, it's just, you're not really going to win that race probably, actually.
Yeah,
in addition to being weaker against the Doomblade, which I have many of. All right, let's call it there. I don't want to record for ages. This show can go on forever. We love talking about Cube, but I want to save some of these other topics for next time, just so we don't talk ourselves out and get too tired. Is there anything you want to say in closing, just in cover? I want to talk about some of these other details. I want to talk about Pillage next week and some other things we've been talking about surrounding those kind of cards. But is there anything else around this draft you want to end on to put a bow in this conversation, Anthony?
No, I'm talked out. You're right.
All right, great. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating in conversations about the show on Reddit. We post all of these shows on the MTG Cube subreddit, so if you want to chat about it, you can do so over there. Anthony and I are also somewhat active members of the MTG Cube Talk Discord, which is linked from the aforementioned subreddit, so you can join us over there to ask questions and talk about the episode. And email us at mail@luckypaper.co if you have questions, comments, any kinds of thoughts, things we can address on the cube, and we'll do it. Until next time, Anthony. And we're in the middle of a rotisserie draft right now, an asynchronous rotisserie draft. So this is going to go on for a little while. I think we'll have some good conversation to come out of that too.
Have you gotten a chance to do your pack one or your cube one?
Pick one. Just pick one.
Just
pick one.
Just pick one.
I'm still waiting on the player prior to me to make their pick so I can make my pick one. I gotta say, I was really hoping no one would take Ancient Tomb, but someone tombed me.
I had my eye on that too, but I'm pretty happy with my first pick.
You had a chance to take it, but you instead took Sulfuric Vortex. We're gonna talk about this next time, you mad lad.
I'm excited to see where this goes.
Madman.